Thanks for being here. Welcome to the channel. I just wanted to use this first video to give a bit of an introduction of what this new channel is all about, and just a bit of background on what I want to do here before the next video, in which we're really going to get into the text of our first book. So, as you've probably figured out from the name of the channel, I wanted to start something that was kind of like a reading group, where we can read a book together while I'm playing a video game, and the video game is probably going to be something loosely related to the book that we're reading. Not intimately related, like if you want to just listen to the audio you can do that, if you want to just watch the stream of the game you can do that, like you don't have to be doing both in order to participate, but I wanted to have some kind of visual element that would maybe complement or augment the discussion of the book to some extent. Now, the first book that I want to read is Capital Volume 1 by Karl Marx, and as you can see, I'm going to be accompanying reading that with a game of Farming Simulator, and if you're interested, I am playing the Nintendo Switch edition. So why did I choose that combination of that book and that game? Well, there's a couple of reasons that I chose Farming Simulator, which is firstly that the reason I bought the game was really to allow me to find a game that would let me concentrate on a lot of the kind of audio stuff, the kind of podcasts and YouTube lectures and interviews and stuff that I watch a lot of and listen to a lot of, but that wouldn't take up all of my attention. So I find that with Farming Simulator, like, it kind of keeps my brain engaged to some extent on what I'm doing. Like I can harvest the crops from this field, for instance, while I'm talking into the microphone in this case, or if I'm listening to somebody else, then I can still concentrate on that, and like I find that they both kind of complement one another. So that that was kind of the reason that I started playing Farming Simulator in the first place. So I thought that maybe it might suit the kind of what might be quite a eventually quite a complicated discussion of a very complicated book. And the other reason, the second reason that I decided to go with Farming Simulator alongside Capital is that I think thematically it's going to fit quite well. I mean, a lot of the things that Marx discusses in Capital are things about commodities and values and prices, and the kind of circulation of commodities from the way that they're produced until sort of eventually their distribution, and the kind of the way that capital circulates around, and you can see value in all its many different forms, all the different forms that capital takes. And I thought that a kind of a game about the kind of cycle of the farming production system, where you grow a crop and cultivate fields and harvest and take things to the market, and all of these different things that I'll be doing in this game to kind of grow this farm, is going to be quite a good mirror for talking about Capital Volume 1, and I might be making the odd sort of reference to what's going on in the game alongside what we're talking about in the book, without, I hope, alienating anybody who isn't watching me play the game and just wants to listen to me talk about the book. So it's going to be passing references at most. I think I'm not going to be asking people to watch absolutely everything that I'm doing in the game, or even anything that I'm doing in the game, in order to engage with the discussion of Capital. So, Capital Volume 1. One of the reasons that I wanted to do this channel is that Capital is notoriously dense and complicated and seems quite kind of impenetrable, and for a really long time I've been trying to understand Marx and Marxism, and I've been sort of listening to and reading people's interpretations of Marx, and people writing about Marx and talking about Marx, and I've been trying to kind of understand some of his ideas in ways that are mediated through people trying to explain them. But eventually I kind of thought that I'd really need to get into the actual text itself in order to come to my own understanding of what Marx was writing about. And it's really in that spirit that I wanted to make this, if I can, and I appreciate that it'll probably take a while to find an audience at all if it does, but I wanted to try to make it as collaborative as possible. I wanted people to read the book along with me and come to their own understandings and interpretations of the text, and really to apply their own experiences and their own kind of everyday lives and their jobs and all of the things that are going to be relevant to the kind of thing Marx is talking about. I wanted people to be able to bring that to their reading of Capital. I should say that I'm not any sort of expert. Like I'm certainly not an economist of any sort. Some of the first few chapters I've already read, like just in trying to read the book for the first time, and in sort of preparing to make these videos. So I've read the first few chapters of Capital Volume 1, but for most of this book I'm going to be reading it for the first time. So I'm not going to be coming at this from a position of expertise, and I hope that this can be as kind of a collaborative an effort as possible, and that if you're reading the book for the first time, then you'll be able to join in with your own contributions and your own interpretations. And if I'm it's completely possible that I'll misinterpret something, or even just skip over something that you think is important, and I'm not going to have any I'm not going to be offended if you point that out, because as I said, like I'm not coming to this from the position of somebody who's read a lot of this stuff and already sort of has an understanding of it. So I'm hoping that if we do end up sort of with a few of us watching these videos and reading this book together, I'm hoping we can kind of help one another understand it better by bringing our own different experiences to it. So if you're someone who does know Capital really well, or is pretty familiar with Marxist theory, although I'd love it if you wanted to stay with us and add your perspective to our experience of reading the book, I do want to just give a bit of fair warning that if you're looking for something a bit more in depth and a bit more granular that goes into the kind of finer details of the debates within Marxism, that you may not be able to find that here. This is really I'm hoping to more kind of provide a space where pretty much anybody can just pick up the book and join in. So I just want to give, I won't be getting into the actual text in this video, that'll be for the next one, but I do just want to give a little bit of background on what I thought were some of the key things to kind of bear in mind when we or before we start to look at Capital Volume 1. So first of all, what is Capital? Well, Capital is this very grand, ambitious attempt by Marx to understand the workings of capitalism, the sort of what's now the global economic system of capitalism. And one of the really important things to bear in mind is that Marx never finished Capital, and in fact he never really got close to finishing it. So we're looking at Volume 1, and that's the one that he actually did finish. Now, Volumes 2 and 3 have also been published, but those were put together from Marx's notebooks by his close friend Friedrich Engels. So we've got those 3 volumes, only one of which was actually finished by Marx himself. But even those 3 ones that we've got are a really small fraction of the original project that Marx actually had in mind. But he died long before he actually got anywhere close to finishing. I remember listening to a talk by Richard Wolff. Richard Wolff is an economist, and he was giving this talk about Marxism, and he said that, if I'm remembering correctly, I think he said that Marx originally planned to write about 11 volumes of Capital. There's another Marxist scholar named David Harvey, who I'll be referring to a lot in these videos because he's spent decades teaching and writing about Capital. But he said that the 3 published volumes of Capital represent maybe an eighth of what Marx actually had in mind, and I think he's being generous with that estimate. So whichever way you look at it, Marx is a really long way from finishing this project when he dies. So there's loads and loads and loads of stuff that he never really gets around to looking at in detail. So while we're reading this book, we might come across ideas that Marx mentions but doesn't go into much, or that he kind of glosses over, and it's always worth us bearing in mind that we are only looking at one little part of this huge, broad analysis of an entire economic system that Marx actually intended to produce. So something that often gets overlooked a little bit about Capital is that it has a subtitle, and the subtitle of the book is A Critique of Political Economy. And I just wanted to briefly look at what we mean when we talk about political economy. So political economy is the study of how societies produce and distribute resources and wealth. So if we just take those 2 words, that word economy is the part that's telling us that we're talking about all of those things that we think about when we think about economies. So jobs and wages and trade and markets and supply and demand and all of those sorts of things. So that's the economy part. But we've got the word political in there as well. And what does that mean? Well, that's telling us that we're also concerned with how those economies are organised. So political economists are interested in not just how the economics works, but what's the best or fairest way to organise an economy and by extension to organise a society. So it's not just a question of what's being produced or how it's being produced, but like who's doing the producing, what are the power relationships in those production processes, how are goods and resources being distributed, and who gets to decide how that's done. Those are all kind of questions that political economists are concerned with. So what Marx is doing with Capital being a critique of political economy is he's responding to the political economists that dominated those sorts of discussions at the time that Marx was writing in the 19th century. And those guys that he's responding to are called the classical economists, and these are guys like Adam Smith, which if you're in Britain like me, he's the guy on the £20 note. And there's also guys like David Hume and David Ricardo and Thomas Malthus. These guys called the classical economists, and they wanted economies to be organised along capitalist lines. So what does that mean? What does it mean? Let's take a look at what we mean when we talk about capitalism. So capitalism, just at a very basic level, is a way of organising an economy based on profit. So if we take a society, and for the purposes of this example, it doesn't really matter if that society is like a village or a town or a city or a whole country or whatever, but we just take a given society. Now that society needs to produce a certain amount of food and clothes and houses and books and spatulas and flannels and all of the other things that people want and need. So it has to make sure, our society has to make sure that all those things are being produced. Now capitalism's answer to this is to allow the means of production, and that's things like land and factories and machines and tools and all those other things that people use to make stuff. Those means of productions are owned by private citizens, just by individual people. So that means that the people who own those means of production can produce things, or they can hire people to produce things, and then they can sell those things for a profit. So that profit is the motivation. That's how capitalism makes sure, or promises it can make sure, that it can produce those things that people want and need. That's what distinguishes capitalism from other economic systems, is that it uses that profit motive as the way to structure the production of things that people want and need. So the idea is, if people want or need something, and you can provide it, then you can make a profit. And that's the way that it tries to ensure that it can get all those things produced. So that's what brings us back to our book, because in Volume 1 of Capital, Marx takes that process of capitalist production and he puts it under the microscope, puts it under this like fierce forensic examination. And it's worth remembering that, as I said earlier, with this just being part one of a much broader, ambitious project, this part is only focusing on production. So he's not going to look at what happens when things go to the market, or he's not going to look at like the banking system very much, or trade, or taxation, or the relationship to the state, and any of those things that we might think of when we think about capitalism. So in this volume, he's just going to be looking at how capitalism produces things. And that may sound like a very simple prospect to you. It may sound like a very complicated one. But it's surprising how much there is to be examined when we think about something as seemingly straightforward as the capitalist mode of production. So in the next video, we're going to get started on looking at the actual text, and we're just going to go straight into chapter 1. And in chapter 1, Marx begins this forensic analysis of capitalism by looking at the commodity. And by the commodity, he means just like the individual book or flannel or spatula or whatever, the individual commodity that's being produced under capitalism. So that's the first chapter of Capital, Volume 1, is all about commodities, and that's where we're going to get into all sorts of interesting ideas about. The first thing we're going to look at is Marx's definition of value and what how he conceives of value, and that's going to be a really important starting point to get into all of the things that we're going to look at throughout the course of looking at this book. So that's what we'll be doing in the next video, is looking at this first chapter on commodities, and I think it's kind of it's tricky picking up a book like Capital because it's not only a very long book with like I mean, I've got a copy that has it's just the first 2 volumes, and it's like 1100 pages or something. So volume 1 I think is about 550 pages. So it's really daunting to begin with, but then you open it up and like it's really dense, and sort of you feel like you have to read every sentence several times before you really understand it. And even then you might read something else that makes you worry that you didn't understand what you thought you understood a minute ago. So and it is really scary like that. Like, I find that Marx can be quite difficult to read in that sense, because with a lot of writers, like, imagine if you were reading like a long journalistic article about, like, I don't know, hospitals, or like, let's say, like the privatization of hospitals. Like, it might begin with an anecdote about being in a hospital or working in a hospital, and it would use that relatable starting point, and then it would go sort of dive down into the weeds and get down to what it wanted to talk about, and get into all of the complicated kind of nuts and bolts of the argument and stuff, and then at the end it would bring you back up to the surface and kind of relate it back to the everyday situation that it began with. With Marx, sometimes you feel a little bit like he just sort of drags you down to the bottom of the ocean right out of the gate, and it's hard to contend with, because you feel like you have to do all of this hard work just to kind of understand how any of the stuff he's saying relates to anything you can relate to, and it is tricky because you feel like you've been kind of thrown in at the deep end, but I think it's going to be worth sticking with, and I think even if you aren't interested in, even if you wouldn't sort of call yourself a Marxist, or you don't identify with that whole kind of that whole tradition of political economy or political thought, I think I get surprised sometimes by how little interest people I meet have with just trying to understand what it was that Marx thought and what it was that he wrote about. I feel like why would you if you wanted to understand capitalism, why would you not engage at all with its greatest critic? So I hope that even regardless of your kind of political leanings or affiliations, I think this is a book worth reading, and I hope that the more of us there are sort of reading it together, reading it for the first time, and not being afraid to not understand things, or to be overwhelmed by by the content. I think the more of us that are doing that, the better. So I'm just finishing up harvesting this field. So I think that's going to be a good time to wrap things up here. What I'm going to do is just get the rest of this grain into my trailer here. And I guess I'm going to just see if there's a good place that I can sell it. Looks like the mill is my best bet. So, sorry, I got a little sidetracked by farming there. So, I hope that just by giving this little bit of background, I hope you're interested enough to want to stick around for the next one and get into chapter 1 of Capital Volume 1 with me. I'm definitely being a little bit selfish in wanting other people to join in with this, because I really feel like my understanding of this book would benefit from other people's perspectives. So I hope that it won't take too long for there to be a kind of small group of us who want to read this book together, and hopefully some of us will have played Farming Simulator a little bit more than I have, because I am a little bit in over my head here. So so I hope that if you've got any questions, or if you've got any corrections, any tips about Farming Simulator, then please do drop them in the comments. And that's it for this video, and I hope I'll see you next time. Thank you very much for watching.